Recently, the regressively religious Fox propagandist Harris Faulkner spread historic falsehoods about the Spanish flu while simultaneously dismissing sickness and death among America's kids during a pandemic as a sacrifice for freedom. Intrigued? Then click that like and subscribe and enjoy the video. So obviously, when it comes to journalistic credibility, the Fox Propaganda Network ranks among the lowest, right? Certainly with the absence of Shep Smith and Chris Wallace. But in the new era, Harris Faulkner has become one of the very worst propagandists on the network. In this segment, which was, aired on the anniversary of D-Day and talking about the invasion of Normandy, Harris Faulkner actually deviated from discussing that historic moment when the Allies bravely invaded, the shores of France to overthrow the Nazi occupation, to talk about pandemics, COVID pandemic, the Spanish flu, and to make some really gross insinuations about the role played by sickness and death among America's kids in 1918 during the Spanish flu, or in 2020, 2021 during the COVID pandemic, and the role that those played in maintaining freedom. So let's listen to this clip and then we'll unpack it.
Over and over. And sometimes we make dangerously bad decisions like pandemic lockdowns and keeping our own children home from schools when a virus was hurting them far less often than adults. We didn't actually close schools in 1918 during the Spanish flu pandemic. We didn't even have penicillin back then. We did sacrifice, we suffered, but then we pressed on. Our enemies hate us for surviving, but they would love to be like us.
So, a couple of things. Again, this is a really gross conflation for a few reasons. Number one, yes, there was a risk, an important risk, to children during the COVID pandemic. It may have been relatively small compared to adults, but there was a risk, number one. Number two, the children could also be carriers for COVID to adults, right? So it wasn't just, we weren't just considering the children, nor should we have, based on the risk to their own bodies. That's one factor. It's one very important factor. But during a pandemic, considering who can be used as a carrier to infect others, even if they themselves are asymptomatic, that's also an important factor. Now, to be sure, there were also negative consequences to school lockdowns in terms of, mental health and education, things like that. No question about it. So I don't begrudge anybody their frustrations with the school lockdowns which occurred in the United States, and also the debate, like the, hindsight being 2020, doing a cost-benefit analysis, was it worth it? Those are all legitimate questions to have, and I don't begrudge that. The frustrating thing was Faulkner's position, almost like this was just, a completely black and white situation, that there was no risk to children, and that the risk of children as carriers to infect adults is insignificant and shouldn't be considered as well. That's gross. It's also gross to discuss this, again, in the context, in my opinion, of like unpacking the anniversary of D-Day. But beyond that, she lied. She just lied, okay? During the Spanish flu outbreak in 1918, which killed 675,000 Americans by the time it was all over, they did close schools. Now, did they close schools to quite the same degree, on quite the same scale? Perhaps not, but many schools were closed. This is an excerpt from a newspaper in October of 1918. There's also many studies about school closures during the 1918 flu pandemic. The fact of the matter is the United States did close schools to address this issue. But beyond that, there's also the sentiment that when it comes to the pandemic, Republicans and conservatives have this very blasé, nonchalant approach to sickness and death. And what do I mean by that? Well, we know, we have the data, that red states and counties and districts which voted for Trump in 2020, they were overwhelmingly less vaccinated, more infected, like the rates of infection were higher in red states and in counties which voted for Trump. And so were the consequent deaths, right? So NPR examined COVID deaths per 100,000 people in roughly 3,000 counties from U.S. from May 2021, the point at which most Americans could find a vaccine if they wanted one. Those living in counties that voted 60% or higher for Trump in November 2020 had 2.26, more than twice the number, twice the rate of deaths that went by for the same margin for Biden. Counties with a higher share of Trump votes had higher mortality rates. Scientific American also did it. People in Republican counties have higher death rates than those in Democratic counties, and COVID death rates are higher among Republicans than Democrats in general during COVID. Of course, so much of this is relevant to the propensity of Democrats and liberals and leftists to have procured the COVID vaccine during the pandemic. For whatever reason, Republicans who had never taken issue with vaccines as far as like a large political movement in the past, like for smallpox and chickenpox, whatever it is, measles, whatever it is, whatever vaccines that you were required to get as part of ordinary civic life, Republicans never took issue with it until COVID, even though, again, the vaccine was created under the administration, not by, but under the administration of a Republican president, and that Republican president, whom they look to as a cultish leader, he has been vaccinated, right? So it makes absolutely no sense, but it's a really sinister, weird, like creepy reaction that Republicans and conservatives very often have to the pandemic. And, listen, for the sake of freedom, our kids need to get sick and die because it's not that big of a deal. Adults get sick and die way more often than these kids during the pandemic. So listen, it's not, we suffered and we moved on. But even in 1918, actually, all over the United States, we attempted to take measures to reduce the spread of the Spanish flu and its consequences. So the idea that we wouldn't do it 100 years later is preposterous. It's absurd. So shame on Harris Faulkner for being weird and creepy about, how like just sacrificing kids and their health and their mortality on the altar of just, we got to suffer and move on. Again, if you want to legitimately criticize the pandemic approach to lockdowns, fair enough. There is plenty to criticize, but it's just the way that she and others like her in the Republic, there was the lieutenant governor of Texas, I believe, in 2020 or 2021 said that we should keep the economy open, even if that means killing grandma and grandpa, because if he had grandchildren, he would be willing to sacrifice himself for the economy. It's so weird. But anyway, I want to share that with you. And hopefully over time, we will see this sort of like death cult mentality fade away.